This is Stephen Mirsky. He's from the USDA as well. And Stephen conducts research on roles in cover crops in cover production, such as crop productivity, weed suppression, water use. And his abstract is called "To Meet the Grand Challenge of Feeding a Growing Global Population, We Must Increase Food Production While Improving Environmental Integrity," in a snapshot. Again, sort of in that same vein, this might be a little more difficult though. Stephen says he is a fan of the Steelers.
Duh.
Which, we've got, I listen, I grew up in Northeast Ohio, so I don't know what football is, and I have great respect for the Steeler franchise, but that doesn't matter right now. I'll turn it over to you, Stephen,
Yeah,
and
sure.
have time.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work we're doing. You can see that Dan and I are busy, so we didn't have perfect amount of time to look at some of our redundant slides. So there's just a couple of redundant slides there, but I'll move through some of those topics quickly. I did see some new people walk into the room between the talks, so I'll cover those themes quickly. This is really a collection of things that are going on here. A lot of networks and research teams and coordinated projects. You'll be getting a little taste of those. But really what birthed this presentation and kind of some of the momentum we have with a lot of the folks involved in this presentation is this pilot project that we initiated with Microsoft and Esri. And so while not a lot of the faces are in that picture there's a lot of staff in the room that have been heavily involved, and a lot of folks from Microsoft and Esri, and it's been a lot of fun working on this pilot project with them to see what we can do in some of our needs and the way we're working with data. So just to quickly review, Dan mentioned this critical issue, right, of this grand challenge of feeding the world. That's a common language now, and this crisis that we're experiencing with this massive increase in population and this food production demands. And so what I just want to emphasize, though, is that not only do we need to do this, and it's going to be a lot harder to do this in the places like the U.S. where we are really, making only incremental changes in yields compared to what we could see possibly in other countries. We've got all these destabilizing factors in agriculture that are going to make it even harder to get there. So Dan talked a lot about climate change, so I'm not going to talk about that, the heat stress, the rainfall patterns, greater floods, and frequency and intensity. But we also have those competing water demands, right? The more water we consume in agriculture is competing demands with human population. As human population grows, this is a big issue. This is one of the big issues today, and we heard about that in the plenary session as well. And then pest management challenges. This might get not as much attention, but I think this is as big of a crisis. We have large swaths of the US right now that have weeds that we can't control with herbicides. They become resistant to 5-6 different chemistries because of our management systems and for a number of reasons. And so we're running out of options controlling a lot of these pests, and they don't go away, right? Pests always find a way. So it's a real critical issue. And then obviously, Dan talked about the declining soil and water quality. So feed the world and increase in population and do it in the face of all these challenges. So that's what we're dealing with. So what does it look like? What do we think are the critical needs going forward? What do these cropping systems look like? They're climate resilient cropping systems, right? So we need crops that are going to be able to deal with wetter springs and drier summers, for example. That's a typical forecast for a lot of the US. Is these wetter springs and drier summers. We need to improve our soil health, certainly, that's a big goal. We need to not only increase the yields, but the yield stability, right? So we want yields that not only can be high, but not a record year one year and then a really terrible year the next year. We want to have more stability and resiliency in our yields. We need integrated pest management programs and then higher nutrient density, certainly, to achieve these goals. So here's our common slide. So precision agriculture is one of the ways we're going to get there, no question. I think that a lot of us in the sustainable ag and movement, in working on these issues, are encouraged now that we feel like that we can start to get site-specific in our solutions enough to address these issues. And precision ag is a big part of this. And what has precision ag primarily focused on? It's varying your rates and your applications, right? So different crop populations that go out into a field, or different, so seeding rates, right? Or different fertilizer levels that might go across the field, or different herbicides might go across the field. But still, this framework of precision agriculture still fits into this low complexity concept that we've been propagating for a long time in agriculture, right? So it's like, okay, yes, there's some variability in the landscape. Let's just go up and down with that rate. And that is certainly helping us deal with some of the challenges that we have. but it still doesn't fully embrace complexity like a lot of the research that goes into and work on sustainable agriculture that's looking at the interactions, right? Not just can we increase the rate or decrease the rate, but how does these sustainable strategies that are part of the solution, and there's just some nice backdrops to some of our long-term cropping systems experiments where we're testing these kinds of concepts. How does sustainable agriculture fit into this too? We know that it's part of the solution. It's what helps build resilience. These are just some of the key strategies in sustainable agriculture, crop rotation being probably the single most important. But these practices are messy, and they're biological often. And you can't just increase a rate or decrease a rate and drive across the field at the same speed, and they add a lot more complexity. And so what we're very focused on is merging precision agriculture with sustainable agriculture. We feel like we've got a lot of tools in the tool belt with precision agriculture. We spend a lot of time understanding complexity in sustainable agriculture. We need to put that complexity into a precision framework and deal with that complexity, these knowledge-intensive systems, right? Things are varying across the landscape considerably, and they respond to their environment all across this field, right? And so we need to be able to understand that complexity to be able to manage that complexity. So let's use cover crops as a case study. Cover crops are simply a non-marketed crop. That's it. Lots of crops that we grow in agriculture are also used as cover crops. They're the crops that we plant in between our cash crops. It's crops that we do not harvest. Typically, we plant them late in the fall, we kill them early in the spring, they provide some erosion benefits, but you can work with legumes that fix nitrogen. Dan talked about that with the tomato system. They can retain nutrients and prevent losses. They can also be used for insect management. So this is just a schematic saying that cover crops provide a lot of services in an agro-ecosystem. And there's not one species that does this. There's lots of different cover crop species, anything that is covering the land in between your cash crop. But how we manage this is just the same way we deal with our cash crops. How we manage these cover crops really affects their performance. So now I flipped the schematic, right? So before you were looking at the benefits of cover crops, and now you're looking at how we manage cover crops affects the cover crop's performance. So seeding costs, weeding this, the genetics, seeding rates, all these things matter. The same kinds of issues that matter in managing our cash crops. And addressing these constraints is what improves their performance, and we define performance as just biomass quality and quantity. So how much you have out there, the above ground biomass, and what is its composition, how much nitrogen, how much carbon, and so on. And there's certainly intrinsic factors that drive this performance, like climate and soil, but then our management is a big part of this, and that's the point of this slide, is that management matters. These things are messy, and they respond to their environment. But here's an example of the kinds of benefits you get from just a little bit, right? So you put a little cover crop out there, you might get a little bit of benefit erosion. You get more biomass out there, you start to affect water infiltration, water quality, forage, all the way up to some of these other services. This is certainly qualitative, it's not quantitative, but I think it's pretty spot on from all my experience. These are the kinds of services you pick up as you increase the performance of the cover crop. And now just to re-emphasize the point, when we want to put these sustainable ag strategies in a precision framework, look at this field. This is just a perfect example. This is what we're typically dealing with in a farming environment. This is just like wet spots, right, where we had poor drainage in a field, and this is our cover crop performing poorly in those spots. We need to be able to take that into consideration in our management. If we get a lot of benefit from cover crops, that's great, but we don't want to turn farmers off from using it because we have these kinds of challenges. How do we deal with these kinds of challenges? And these are geospatial solutions, right? So we need to build the knowledge to manage complexity, and I think that the first presentation really captured a lot of that. These are component experiments. For example, this is an experiment that I'm running across the country right now on integrated weed management and looking at a lot of different herbicide-resistant weed management strategies, including cover crops. These are individual research stations across the country. That's going to get us some data, but it's limited, right? And that's not going to allow us to build geospatial solutions. We need more data. We need these longitudinal data sets, right, which was discussed, the LTAR data. And ARS is investing heavily in this, about 20 sites across the country where we're getting long-term data. Not giving us the spatial piece, but it's giving us the long-term data, and that's part of the story. We also need on-farm networks. And so that's a big part of what I've been focusing on, is building large national on-farm networks. And I'll give a brief little primer about that. I think this is how we get at the geospatial. So we've been building up a team of folks working on questions related to water, nitrogen, and weeds with cover crops. We're on these big farms where there's strips of with and without cover crops. We're monitoring the biomass. Let me see if I can get that to get up there. Okay, nope. Yeah, we're measuring the biomass here, so it's just showing its decomposition, and where you see it monitoring next to real-time water infiltration, storage, and availability through depth-structured sensors. We're also developing different image approaches for folks with low-tech solutions and higher-tech solutions for capturing images of weeds and weed crop competition in these fields. And this is what just some of this looks like. We started with a 30-farm network. Now we're at 140. And the next year we hope to be about 230 farms across the country. So our new network now is expanded. We have farms all throughout north central and south central US as well as part of this project. And so this is how we think we build these kinds of geospatial solutions. These are just more pictures of what a farm landscape might look like that we're working on. So here's just a big strip of cover crop, no cover crops, and we're monitoring in these fields. And networks. And that's what I think that the first presentation really captured, right? Is that we need to network. It can't just be a bunch of scientists working together. It can't be just a bunch of coordinated long-term studies and on-farm studies, but it's putting this all together in a space that we can work with this data, that we can move data in real time, and that we can populate the kinds of models and tools we need to inform farmer practice. And that picture just emphasizes these regional cover crop councils of folks who are getting together to do these kinds of things, and I've been kind of working a lot with those groups. So let's now dial into kind of our case example here of how we're using this to develop geospatial solutions. So we're trying to link up a lot of different sensor technology on these farms, right? We have various different sensors. We have satellites, we have high buoys, so equipment with sensors on them. We have drones, we have these low-cost sensors in the field. We're doing destructive sampling. There's all these different types of sensing applications, but we haven't really well-defined the technology with the application. We've got lots of application goals, but what's the right resolution that we need? How do we link this up in real time? These are difficult issues. And so working in large teams, we're trying to collect the kinds of data sets from all of these different types of sensing systems to be able to kind of define that space, and most importantly then develop decision support tools. The question earlier was asked, how are we getting this in the hands of growers? So this is a big part of the technology transfer vision, right? Is that we want to develop decision support tools and models that are serving all stakeholders. And so these decision support tools certainly can inform policy. Folks who are, there's lots of cost share programs out there and subsidies to help growers to do different things, and crop insurance. We want our tools and our information in the hands of those policymakers and decision makers so they have the information they need to make informed decisions about policy. We certainly want to be directly working with, introduce the researchers first, the what-if questions, obviously. What if we increased adoption by 50% of cover crops in the Chesapeake Bay watershed? How much does that reduce nutrient loading? We can ask these what-if questions at landscape scales by building this comprehensive, integrated data sets and breaking down these data silos. And then in our decision tools, informing farmers, both from the farmers who are just going to scratch and sniff, right? They're not that really taking deep dives on the technology and making on the fly decisions with this tech. They're like, oh well, let me see how does this tell me, what does this tell me about my system? Or they can do a little bit of what if scenarios too if they want to probe in with the curiosity. And then there is the folks who are using the full-fledged decision-making applications where a priori technology in the field, like tractors, are varying applications in real time with information that was based on a lot of the data we've collected around from remote sensing and other applications, right? And we're taking a hybrid approach. We're doing expert opinion models and tools. We're using empirical and process-based and machine learning and hybrid modeling approaches. But again, resolution, bringing up that point, resolution matters. What's the right resolution to solve the problem? Is it satellites? Is it drones? We've been concerned about these issues, so we bought this highboy technology. Can you see here? This is just a tractor that can elevate and get really high, can get above a corn canopy, and we can take a lot of sensing information about that and a lot of our different fields. And so we're trying to just kind of make sense of all this and put this together. So here is a first slice of that effort in this pilot project. that we've done with Esri and Microsoft, where we were using the Esri to work with us on this reflectance data from this satellite and help us with the filtering of the best images and merging those later and building the flat tables that we need for doing the kinds of analysis that we do downstream. And so this is just an example of one of my graduate students taking biomass samples to do the ground truthing side of this equation. And the reason why I'm emphasizing Venus is that we were really excited about having access to this new satellite that was flying over our region. You can see the kind of difference in the resolution between Sentinel and Venus. Venus gives, well, this image doesn't actually come out as clean as it does on this monitor, but we have huge differences in the resolution. We're talking about something that Venus, which is getting us down to a 5 meter pixel resolution, so it's very high quality data with a lot more different wavelengths to work with. And so Sentinel is something that a lot of us all have access to, right? It's pretty easy to get, and folks have a lot of experience working with this. Venus is this new satellite with the kind of data that we need the kinds of products and solutions that Esri is offering, right? So here's the kinds of products that we need to process that kind of images. So ArcGIS Pro has been really good at that, and we partner with Esri to help do some of that. Here's some images of our fields, and for many of you in the room, this is a familiar site. And here's a little video of that, this is now NDVI, for example, of one of our fields over time. So it's just showing you from the fall, when there's no cover crop planted, to the spring, and it starts to get greener and greener and greener. And that's a cloudy day, and you can see that it gets greener and greener. So these are very high quality satellite data over time to show you how that changes over time. But how do we then use that information, and what's the appropriate application? So first, we obviously want to relate this satellite imagery, this NDVI metrics, to biomass. This is a goal that a lot of folks have right now is whether it's high throughput phenotyping for breeding or whether all types of land use, folks are focused around quantifying what's on the ground and how much is there and its quality. And so we use a lot of different indices that you can develop from this satellite, and found that that pretty much across all these different indices, NDVI consistently holds as one of the best, and it's still the most commonly used, and so that was what we'll continue forward, showing you some NDVI data. We were interested in how, when you capture that satellite image, how does that relate to the quality of the correlation between that satellite image and biomass. And of no surprise, the closer you take your image to the time you take your destructive sample, so this is like in the fall, this is in the spring, right, at destructive sample, no surprise that that's the best relationship. We wanted to look at that because we know that NDVI saturates really quickly. When you're estimating what's on the ground, once you get above about 1,500 to 2,000 kilograms per hectare of biomass, and this is from our data from this experiment, this has been well documented in the literature, that it flattens out. That once you get above this threshold of biomass, the satellite imagery with NDVI is going to saturate out. It's not going to give you that information. And the problem is that most of the things we want to know happens at that 1,500 kilogram per hectare of biomass and up, right? We want farmers in the 4,000, 5,000 range, or at least 3,000 to 4,000 range. And if we're not able to capture that, it's going to be hard for us to be able to provide precision models and decision support around that. And that's why, we're looking at the kinds of spectrum of things. So now, like, for example, with LiDAR technology on this little box and NDVI and a GPS unit, we can in real time capture the differences in height of the cover crop. So we can build indices that, take into consideration the architecture now, right? How much coverage and how much height. That gets us the ability to estimate more biomass. What are the right tools? What are the right approaches? That's part of what we're still trying to figure out, but I think there's some nice nuanced approaches that we could take. For example, here's that spring when we have low variance in the fields, right? Not a lot of biomass and not a lot of differences across the whole field, to where we get really saturated over here where most of it is pretty green, right? So if you're looking at the standard deviation around that metric over time, you can see that when the values are low, there might be a lot of variability, but it's not that informative. But when we get to this asymptote here, before we flatline out here where all that biomass is and we're not able to detect differences, at this asymptote we know we have the best chance to detect what's out there in the landscape. How much biomass is out there. That's not going to be corresponding to the time we kill that cover crop, which affects how we build our tools, but we can use that information, for example, with process-based models to then project forward what that biomass might be, or we could build simple sampling tools for growers. We can go and find at that time when that variance was highest, send them out to that sweet spot of where it's the biggest cover crop and where it's the smallest cover crop. Using kind of these geospatial platforms, we can get them out in their field, they can reference that location, they can take a sample from that field. Farmers don't like to get out off their tractors, but but we can minimize that to a very localized, specific point in the field where, okay, here's the high point, here's the low point, and then we can apply that attribute across all that data set to then create real spatial maps of the performance of that cover crop. And here's just examples of what that might look like on a farmer's field and the kind of scaling up that would look like for farms and distributed across a state. So really excited that we had this opportunity to collaborate with Microsoft and Esri in this pilot project. It's been a lot of fun, learned a lot so far, and we've got a lot of thoughts on how to move forward and where we want to go with this. We're looking forward to testing some more of the kinds of software applications that they have with our data sets, and so we're starting to collaborate around their FarmBeats product and looking at on our research stations as well as testing its functionality on our on-farm networks. We think that there's a lot of value there and we can serve in real-time data aggregation, linking up lots of different types of data streams and putting that into real-time into our decision tools. So I certainly want to thank all of the folks that we've been working with in those groups. I look forward to the future, which consists of, again, breaking down data silos and building the kind of databases needed, using these kinds of large databases to then do the model validation and calibrations that we need to build the tools and inform the tools, and then obviously rolling out the tools, and then building this whole ecosystem of tools and practices and farmers and actors all working together so that we can have lots of tools communicating, lots of databases communicating, all the kinds of things that Bruce and Dan so elegantly presented on. So with that.
Excellent. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Curious, what do you feel is you have all this evidence of the benefits of cover crop soil management. What do you feel is the greatest barrier for wide scale adoption of cover crop soil management? With all that evidence, is it just the added complexity of required to see the benefits? What do you think?
So the question is there's clearly some benefits to cover crops. Why do we not see more adoption? That's the number one question. So it's a complex issue. There's been a lot of work done on this. A lot of social scientists, a lot of surveys on the barriers to adoption, and we have a lot of that kind of data. We know what some of those barriers are. It comes down to a pretty simple equation. When commodity prices are really low, it's hard, the margins are tight. Putting money towards cover crops is a real challenge, right? And commodity prices are really low right now. But the farmers who do experience and work with cover crops, the proven benefits are there. We don't sell cover crops as a one-size-fits-all model, and that's super important. I think that's what really hurt cover crop adoption, is that it got promised as this ultimate solution. And the reality of it is what I look for a cover crop in Iowa is going to be very different than what I want from it in Florida versus what I want from it in Texas or what I might want from it in San Diego. And so we need to be focusing on what are the services that we can optimize with cover crops for different regions. That might be watershed concerns like the Chesapeake Bay. So Maryland took that seriously. We have the largest adoption of cover crops in the country. We're at 75 or 80%. That's because we subsidize. We pay farmers. And we're not just paying the early adopters a little bit of money. We're paying the middle adopters a lot of money, so much so that they can even pull back some money from the program because it's really a very hefty paycheck to plant cover crops. So where we do incentivize, we see that. We see cover crops as the number one equip practice now with NRCS. So we see a lot of folks focusing on that from a cost share. But we also see a lot of farmers who, once they have 3 to 5 years of experience with cover crops and they see the benefits, and they're complex. They're not always obvious. It's not did it bump up my yields or not? That's not the only part of the story. After 3 to 5 years, a lot of those farmers really take to it. And so that's a part of what we try to really help do is get farmers over that threshold, that learning curve, and and where they see where it works for them and how it works for them. I've got some farmers, the sole reason they like it is they think the soil is more friable and more moldable when they want to plant. They get better crop populations and get a better seed placement. That is not a goal that I was targeting with cover crops. So.
But sometimes it's, it's the gut instinct, right? He thinks it's better, so he's willing to do it for it. So fantastic, right? Yes.
What do you got from the angle of communities, like I live in the Southwest, I live in the desert, and if they don't do a cover crop, and a lot of them don't, we all end up with dust, dirt everywhere. And have you ever gone the direction of talking to the community that this would be something good to invest in for all our health and better air in the area and help in that way?
So the question was, are we communicating to the larger communities and about the value of cover crops? And I'm assuming you're talking more in terms of the lay public who are not in agriculture per se?
Yes.
Okay. We get caught up in our little echo chambers with cover crops right now. I mean, all over the government, all over land grant universities, the whole sustainable ag communities, cost share programs. Cover crops are everywhere. They're popping up everywhere. Are they in the popular press? You're seeing more and more articles in the Washington Post. I saw the other day, or the New York Times, I saw an article about the role of cover crops and soil health. So you're seeing some of that language enter mainstream. I'm not directly doing that. I do on-farm field days. I talk directly with farmers. But I am trying to interact with some of the groups who are, and I see some of that happening. So, for example, Unilever is a consumer company, right? They're a really big company, and they have a good handle on what consumers want. And they are investing heavily right now in certain regions in cover crops and cost-sharing farmers on cover crops because they're feeling pressure from the public to do those things. So I think those are the kinds of groups that researchers like myself and the industry, that we partner with need to be able to be at that space talking with those groups. And so there is evidence of some of that. I know the Nature Conservancy is actually trying to directly talk to landowners. So a lot of our land in the U.S. is not owned by the farmer. Right? Farmers are leasing 50% of their land on average. So investing long-term into your land is a hard choice to make when you don't even know if you're going to be on that field next year. And so Nature Conservancy is talking to those groups, farm landowners, and educating them on stewardship and soil health and cover crops. So I think some of that is happening.
You just mentioned Unilever. Are there any other sort of big companies or users like that you can point to who are actually not just using cover crops, but are actually utilizing, what you had gotten into before this kind of precision agriculture platform where they're sort of using a combination of sensors and other technologies to see, okay, where might we be using certain things and, where might the cover crops be appropriate and sort of using the technology to maybe have a more, like you said, a precision agriculture approach to planting and things like that.
I'm not sure I captured the question part.
So I mean, are there certain companies or users that are using the technology in a sort of holistic way, like that's showing them how to, more sustainably grow?
Well, I think that there's an enormous amount of energy in the private sector in agriculture right now coming up with precision solutions. There's a tremendous amount of energy. Esri is really motivated around this. Microsoft is very motivated around this. And there's a lot of chemical companies that are very, so I think a lot of the big ag companies are very focused around this digital ag revolution that's happening and providing the platforms and the services and the tools that are being used. I mean, I think it's a lot of folks are doing that. I mean, there's also, that's also happening at the grassroots level where there's a lot of small, like NGO type groups that are developing open source platforms and interoperability amongst tools and things like that. So I think that it's happening at both levels, and there's a lot of energy around this. I think right now is trying to see through all of this energy and focus specific applications, and that's why it's been a lot of fun to take a simple use case like of what I'm bringing to and work with some of these companies to help visualize our use case in their products and understand what they can do to work for us and how it can work for farmers. So that's been a really big learning curve for me.
This is your presentation, not mine, but I can give you a little feedback as well from the software side. We're seeing that the companies like the Bentonville, Arkansas-based companies of the world are saying, we need to sell more groceries, and we're interested in the farmers performing best practices to do that. They're not down to the point of saying you need to work in cover crops, but they're just saying we're encouraging you to produce as much product as possible so that we have to sell it. And so eventually they may get down to the point of saying we think you should do these things, but today it's not there, is my experience.
And cover crops is really just the one that's easiest to land on, right? Sustainability, conservation, soil conservation, soil health, all these things. People look for a tangible thing they can do. What are the two things that typically come up? Reducing tillage, adding cover crops, right? Those are the two main tactics. So that's why it's getting a lot of attention, but there's a lot
Absolutely.
that can be done.
Okay, folks, thank you for your time. Make sure you fill out the survey.